Now let's have a look at how we can create variables within Visual Studio and talk a little bit more about them. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we create our first C# console program. So in order to do that, we start Visual Studio 2022, and I'll do that by just opening the Windows tab and write Visual Studio, and you can see it immediately suggests Visual Studio 2022. Let's start this and then create a new project. And then this is important. We choose console app. Now, if console app doesn't appear, you should check back to the troubleshooting guide of the installation process. Now we press next. I will call this variable demo, and you can choose a location that is appropriate for you. I will put it on the desktop. And yeah, we can use .NET 6.0. All right, now that we are in Visual Studio, let's create our first variable. Now let's start with an integer variable, and the short for integer is int. So this is the data type. Now I need to use a name for the variable, so I'll call it just my first var. And I add a semicolon. Now these semicolons are really important. You must never forget them at the end of every command in C#. Now we have this my first var, and you can already see that Visual Studio is suggesting me to add this line of code, and I'll just do this, which will save the value 0 in this variable. Now I already told you variables are containers for values, so we have now the value 0 in there. However, let's just save the value 15 in there. Now what we might want to do is, again, what Visual Studio already suggests here, we want to write it into the console. So let's just press console.writeLine, and then we will write two things. First, I will write a number. So let's just write the number 7. And then I will write my first variable. Okay. So both times a number will be printed. Here we will print a value directly. And here we will print the content of this variable. That's pretty important. So when I start this program, I should first see hello world, then the number 7, and then the content of my first variable, which is the number 15. So let's check this out. All right, so in order to test the program and start it, we press up here the play button next to the name of the project. So let's hit play. And here we can see hello world, which is this line of code. Then we can see this line of code, 7. And then, as I told you, not the text my first var is printed, but the content of this variable is printed. That's pretty important. All right, so now let's try something new. I will now set my first variable to some new value. So I'll just set it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I will print it again. And for new programmers, it's usually not completely clear what will happen now, because there are multiple options. Will there be printed 2 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is the last thing that we assigned? Or will here be printed 15 and here be printed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? It's usually not completely clear for new programmers. But do keep in mind, the code is executed from top to bottom, like in the code.org example that we all tried out. So it will only execute one command after another. And when the computer executes this line of code, it actually doesn't know what will come after this line of code right now. Okay, so keep this in mind as we execute the code line by line. All right, so in order to show you what I just said, I will create a so-called breakpoint. And I can do this by just clicking on this gray bar to the left. And here you can see such a red dot if you click here. And what this red dot does is it pauses the program as soon as it reaches this line of code. And I can then manually step through the code line by line. So let's see what I mean by this. I just hit play up here again. And now you can see we wrote hello world, which is in this line of code. And then nothing else happens. And now the program is stuck at this line. So this line has not yet been executed. And we can now look at the content of my first var before this line is executed. So let's hover over it. And we can see, if I zoom in here a little bit, my first var has a content value of 0. So if then this line is executed where we set the content of my first var to 15, we will see what happens. So I can execute this line of code by just pressing this step over button or F10 on your keyboard. So now jump over this line. And now this line has been executed also. So let's hover over this variable again. And we can see it now contains the value 15, which is exactly what we programmed. So we learned something here. Integer variables are initialized with a value of 0. So if we don't set anything, they will have a default value of 0. However, if we then set them to something with this equals operator, the value 0 will be overwritten with the 15. Now, let's see in the console, nothing else has happened here. So now we're in this line of code. I press step over again. And now we printed 7 to the console. Let's see the console again. And yes, the 7 was printed. Now we see here my first variable will now be printed. And what the computer actually does in here is it replaces this variable with the content of it. So in this case, it will just replace this with 15. So let's jump over and see if that was correct. Yes, now the 15 was printed to the console. And now we set my first variable, which is still 15, to this new value, 12,345. And I now jump over it, hover over the variable again, and we see the value 15 is gone. And instead, this value was replaced with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we then execute this line of code too, see back here in the console, you can already see it wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so that's just something you have to keep in mind. If you first print the variable and then reassign it to something different and print it again, at first it will have the previous value, and only after you reassign it, it will have the new value. So that's pretty important when working with variables. Now let's have a look at another mistake new programmers tend to do when coming from math. Now in math, it doesn't matter if you write my first var equals 15 or if you write 15 equals my first var. However, for programming languages, that's a fundamental difference. You can see here it is underscored in red, which means this is an error. And that's because this equal sign is not exactly the same as it is in the common math world. So in the computer language, you have to read this equal sign differently. This is the assign operator. So what it does is it takes the value on the right of it and saves it into the variable on the left of it. So in this case, it would take the content of my first var and would try to save it in the value 15, which doesn't work because you can't save anything in a value. You can only save stuff in a variable. So the only way you can assign variables is by using variable name equals and then the value you want to save into the variable. That's pretty important and a common mistake of new programmers. Now we covered quite a bit in this video. You learned how to create an integer variable, how to debug your code and execute it line by line, and how to print something into your console. In the next video, we will have a look at how we can create different variables with different data types.